Today we will be going over the internal anatomy of a fish, and this presentation is geared towards students with the 1st through 3rd grade scholastic level. So, a brief overview of the presentation. We'll be covering different organs and giving some small facts about them along the way. We'll be going over the swim bladder, the heart, and the liver, the urinary system covering the kidneys, the ureters, and the urinary bladder. Also, we will be speaking about the stomach, the intestines, and Gill Arches. So we'll start with the swim bladder. It is a thin-walled structure that resembles a sac, and it fills with the gas to help the fish maintain its buoyancy. Buoyancy being the ability to float in water, air, or other fluids, but we're just emphasizing water in this case. The fish adjusts the size of the swim bladder by letting gas in or releasing gas from the oval window, which is at the opening to the swim bladder. The oval window is also called the gas gland. By adjusting the size of the swim bladder, the fish can obtain neutral buoyancy, meaning it will float in place. It can rise or it can sink. The swim bladder is located right below the spine of the fish, which also helps the fish float upright and not tilt in an odd direction. So here's our first fun fact of the day. The swim bladder actually functions a lot like a balloon. The fish inflates it when it wants to float and deflates the bladder when it wants to sink. The image on the right shows the inflation and deflation of the swim bladder. Fish that have a damaged or diseased swim bladder may float constantly, sink to the bottom of their habitat, or tilt in weird directions. This is known as swim bladder disorder, and is commonly seen in aquarium fish. This little video below shows us some of the symptoms of the swim bladder disorder. So next, talking about the heart, and the heart of the fish has 4 chambers, known as the atrium, the ventricle, the bulbus arteriosus, and the sinus venosus. The function of a fish heart is fairly similar to the function of our heart, as it's used to pump blood throughout the body. However, one of the major differences is that it also supplies blood to the surface of their gills. Now, we don't have gills, but our hearts do supply blood directly to our lungs to aid in respiration, so there is a small similarity. The heart is located right between the gills and the liver of the fish, and you can see it labeled below.
Alrighty, so now I'll be discussing the liver. So not only does it help regulate and control blood, but it also helps with digestion by breaking down food. This is done by releasing special proteins. They help break down fats and sugars from the food that the fish has eaten. The sugars from the food is broken down into smaller pieces known as glucose. These smaller pieces will provide the fish with more energy, and any leftover is changed into another substance called glycogen. This is then stored in the liver for future use, and the liver can also make their own proteins for other applications and uses. The liver is located between the stomach and intestines, and in figure 6 you can see a comparison between a human liver and fish liver. Alrighty, so moving on to the urinary system. We group the system together just to simplify it. So the kidneys are very important and crucial to the fish. Rather than being bean-shaped like the ones we have, the kidneys in fish are very narrow and super long, and they do take up a lot of space inside. They work to regulate and control fluid that passes through the fish, and it's changed to urine. The ureters are small tubes that transport the urine produced by the kidneys into the urinary bladder, which will then be stored until it eventually leaves the fish. The biggest difference for fish and humans is that fish have to worry more about fluid balancing and also worrying about the saltwater concentration that's around them, compared to where freshwater fish just have to worry about whatever is in the water that's around them. Next is the stomach and intestines. The stomach breaks down food to allow the fish get the right vitamins. Once they reach the intestines, the stomach doesn't absorb much, but it does contain a significant structure known as the caloric ceca, which will release proteins to help break things down, similarly like the liver does. The intestine does the absorbing and moves the food around, just like we saw in a previous presentation where Garrett used bread in plastic bags to show the movement. The intestines will move this broken down food around until eventually exiting the fish. The stomach is located above the liver, and the intestine is located below the liver toward the belly of the fish. Here's our third fun fact. The length of the intestines depend on what the fish eats. This is a general rule when looking at any animals, including us. Meat eaters or carnivores have shorter intestines because meat is easier to break down than plants. Plant eaters or herbivores have longer ones because plants have a lot of fiber and they do have a special sugar called cellulose that requires a lot of work to break down. So this means that fish that eat both are known as omnivores and have an intestine that is medium-sized. So for example, if you were to compare a redfish with a mullet, you would notice that the redfish have smaller intestines and the mullet have larger intestines, and this is because the redfish primarily eat small crustacean and small fish as well, and as the mullet consumes types of algae and seaweed, which require a lot of work to break down, which is why they have relatively super long intestines. So the last structure that I'll be covering are the gill arches. They are bony or cartilaginous bars that are located behind the gills. So if you take a second to think about what cartilaginous features might we possess, you'll come to find out that structures like the nose, the ears, cartilage and joints, the spine, and because cartilage is flexible and supportive, it makes sense why fish have more, as to help them float and move effortlessly throughout the water column. So in the gill arches, it supports the gills so that they can open and close to help them with breathing and exchange different gases and nutrients. And as we mentioned previously, we have been talking about bony fishes in general, but we did want to add that the number of gill arches differs within classes and groups. So for example, bony fishes like redfish have 3 to 5, while cartilaginous fish like sharks have 7, and jawless fish like lampreys and hagfish are also known to have 7. So now I'll go ahead and pass it on to the last presenter.
Okay, so I'm just going to go over a brief summary of all of the structures that we have covered so far, highlighting their location and function to prepare you all for the interactive game we have at the end. The swim bladder is located right below the spine, and it inflates and deflates to help the fish control their buoyancy. Next up is the heart, which is located between the gill arches and the liver. It pumps blood throughout the body of the fish and across the gills to help with gas exchange and respiration. The liver is located between the heart and the stomach, well, thereabouts at least, and it secretes enzymes to aid in digestion, and stores food energy in the form of glycogen for later use. The kidneys are located directly on either side of the spine, and remove excess fluid from the fish's body, or they help maintain fluid depending on what the fish needs. The ureters are connected to the kidneys and the urinary bladder, and they transport the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The urinary bladder is connected to the ureter, and it is located towards the back fin of the fish, not the tail, and it holds the urine before excretion. Next up is the stomach, which is located right above the liver, and it helps to break down food for digestion. The intestine is located below the liver, and it receives the broken down food from the stomach to continue the digestive process, as it breaks down the food even more and absorbs key nutrients. What isn't absorbed is excreted as waste. Lastly, we went over the gill arches, which are located right behind the gills at the front of the fish. They help to support the gills so the fish can obtain oxygen and essentially breathe properly. Now that we have gone over all of the structures, we have a little interactive game set up for you guys. Now you'll probably recognize this silly little fish from the presentation, and I'm going to give you a number, and I want you to tell me the structure that is associated with the number on the slide. I will give 15 seconds for each structure. So who can tell me what structure number 1 is? Alright, moving on. Does anyone know about structure number 2? Okay, moving on. Does anyone know what structure number 3 is? Moving on, can anyone identify structure number 4? Alright, moving on to structure number 5. Can anyone tell me what that is? Okay, can anyone tell me about structure number 6? You know what that one is? Alright, structure number 7. Does anyone know which one that is? Moving on to structure number 8, we're almost done here. Can anyone tell me what structure number 8 is? Alright, and lastly, structure number 9. What structure is that? Okay, so that is our little game, and on the next slide I have an. Here is just a brief overview of the little identification game with the answer key on the left. The first structure was the Gill Arches, the second structure was the stomach, the third were the intestines, the fourth structure was the liver, the fifth structure was the swim bladder, the sixth structure was the kidney, seventh was the heart, the eighth structure was the ureter, and the ninth structure, towards the bottom, was the urinary bladder. Alright, and here are our resources. The little fish we used for the identification game was taken from Commons, and I did the labeling myself, so it is not cited on this page. Alright, so that's it, guys. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, just let us know. Try to answer any questions you may have.